Greetings, it's the Digital Dog, and in this video tutorial I want to cover the color settings and color management in Adobe Camera Raw. And I do want to point out that primarily Adobe Camera Raw is a raw converter. It is used to render images from raw data into a color space, and let's take a look at some of the options available in Adobe Camera Raw. So color management in Adobe Camera Raw. All of the processing that is conducted, and this is true with raw data or if you are using Adobe Camera Raw on an existing rendered image, but most importantly when you are editing raw data, the underlying color space uses the ProPhoto RGB color gamut. And that's because raw data has the potential of having a very large color gamut. If you set your camera for sRGB or Adobe RGB and capture a JPEG, you're clipping a lot of potential color that you could capture in the scene, but raw data does not have that limitation. And that's one of the reasons why Adobe has provided a very large underlying color space and color gamut for doing all of its processing. Now, raw files do not have a color gamut per se. In fact, digital cameras and scanners don't really have a color gamut, and we don't have time to go there. But the important thing to understand is that raw data has the potential to render the data that you've captured from the sensor in RAW to a color space like Adobe RGB or sRGB or ProPhoto RGB, and it has a very large color gamut potential. There are absolutely scenes in nature that fall outside the color gamut of Adobe RGB 1998. So there are scenes that you can capture from RAW that you can encode into a color space that fall outside the gamut of Adobe RGB 1998. And that is one of the reasons that we capture raw data, and that's one of the reasons why Adobe Camera Raw has such a large color space used for processing. So all of the processing in Adobe Camera Raw, or what we're going to call ACR, takes place in what's called high bit, which is more than 8 bits per color. It may be 10 bits per color, 12 bits per color. In a few rare cases, there are capture devices that truly produce 16 bits per color. So I prefer to call this high bit. Adobe Camera Raw and RAW files are all high bit, and Adobe Camera Raw is going to use the ProPhoto RGB size color gamut for all its processing. So to go back to this idea of RAW files and color gamut and scene gamut, what you might be actually photographing, it's a myth that digital cameras capture sRGB. Digital cameras are not limited to the sRGB color gamut. Certainly, if you photograph a lot of scenes that are low in color gamut, for example, if you were to just photograph a gray card, or a white dog on snow, or a black cat on coal, or even a lot of images of just skin tone, those scenes have a color gamut which fit within sRGB. But if you then take the same camera and photograph a very colorful field of flowers or a saturated blue sky, it's very possible that these scenes have a color gamut that greatly exceeds the color gamut of both sRGB and Adobe RGB. So again, camera sensors capture very saturated colors that fall outside the color gamut of both sRGB and even Adobe RGB 1998. So what our goal is to capture as much color as possible and then be able to edit it, if necessary, reproduce it on a device that can use all those colors, like a wide gamut inkjet printer. Yes, it's true that a lot of images are going to end up on the web or mobile devices that are going to be converted into sRGB, but that doesn't mean that from the get-go you want to convert your RAW files into such a small color gamut. You want to encode your RAW files into a high resolution, high bit depth, wide gamut color space like ProPhoto RGB so that you can use all that color that you've captured for reproduction for any device that you may use in the future. Now, in Adobe Camera Raw, we have a histogram that gives us a very good indication whether or not we're clipping colors. I'm going to explain the histogram in detail, but what I want to show you right here is a scene that just doesn't seem like it's super saturated. This is an old picture taken in Sydney, Australia, and it doesn't look super saturated, but nonetheless what you're seeing in the histogram in the upper right is color clipping. You'll notice that in the histogram there's a spike on either side at the very end of the histogram, and you'll notice that the little triangles on either side are lit up. One is magenta on the far left and one is red on the far right. I'll talk about this in more detail, but what this histogram is telling me is that we're clipping colors, that there's color saturation beyond either side of the histogram that we might be able to contain, but because we're using, in this case, sRGB, we're clipping colors. And you can see in the workflow options below, we are set to sRGB. In a second, I'll go into Adobe Camera Raw and show you exactly what I mean. But look what happens if we instead pick ProPhoto RGB. The histogram instantly updates and the clipping indicators are gone. Because ProPhoto RGB is such a large color gamut, it's able to contain those very saturated colors. So here I am in Adobe Camera Raw, and again you can see that the clipping indicators for shadow and highlight show me a red spike and, in this case, a purple spike at the very end. If I click on this, you'll see that there's an overlay that shows me all of the clipping that's happening in this particular image. Now, when we talk about the histogram in general, exposure will allow us to blow out highlights. You'll notice now that the histogram is pure white. That's because all three color channels have clipped. But if I go back to the original rendering, where I had my exposure set at -6.9, what's clipping is just the red channel, because the color is too saturated in these yellow boats. Difficult to see what's clipping in the shadows, but we don't have to really look. Adobe Camera Raw is telling us that this color channel is clipping. It's showing us because this little triangle is purple. Now, if I simply click on this link down here, this is called the workflow options, and select instead of sRGB here, if I select ProPhoto RGB, watch what happens. I don't even have to click OK. The histogram actually updates in real time and the clipping is gone. So here's Adobe RGB. There's still a little bit of clipping, far less than sRGB, but there's still some red channel clipping here and there's some blue channel clipping here. If I pick sRGB, it's much worse. And if I pick, which I recommend, ProPhoto RGB and select OK, all the clipping is gone. There's no saturation clipping. So let's look at these histograms in more detail. So here is the decoder ring for the clipping indicators. And what you're seeing is that if the triangles light up white, as you see in the upper histogram, all three color channels are clipping, red, green, and blue. And that means the highlights and shadows are clipping, and you probably need to alter the exposure settings to bring that down so that you're not clipping those particular colors, unless, of course, you really do want to clip them. Now, when you see an individual color, not white, that color indicates what color channel is clipping. So it starts out pretty simple, but gets a little more complex depending on the color. So red, that you see on the far right, indicates that our red channel is clipping. Green would indicate that the green channel is clipping. And blue would indicate that the blue channel is clipping. That much is pretty simple. But there's a possibility that we might be clipping two color channels. So again, if we clip all three color channels, it's white. If we clip one color channel, that color shows up. If, however, you notice a yellow triangle, you see the spike on the far left of the upper histogram, that indicates that both red and green channels are clipping. If you see a magenta spike or a magenta triangle, it indicates that both red and blue channels are clipping. And if you see a cyan spike or triangle, that indicates both green and blue are clipping. Here's an easy way to understand what's clipping, although it's really not important that you know which channels. You need to fix the issue if you don't want those to clip. So in the case of cyan, the way I think of it is the opposite of cyan is red. So that means red is not clipping. Otherwise, green and blue are clipping. If we look at magenta, what's the opposite of the color magenta? The opposite of magenta is green. That means green is not clipping, therefore red and blue are clipping. And if we look at yellow, the opposite color of yellow is blue. That means the blue channel is not clipping. Therefore, red and green are clipping. So if you really want to know what two color channels are clipping, look at the color that's being indicated. So for example, cyan. The opposite of cyan is the color that is not clipping. The opposite of cyan is red. That means green and blue channels are both clipping. what we want to do is look at the workflow options in Adobe Camera Raw, primarily for color space. You want to pick ProPhoto RGB for what I would like to call your master images. That would be the highest resolution, widest color gamut, highest bit depth that you're going to capture, that you're going to then bring into Photoshop and perhaps edit and then use for subsequent output. That output could be for the web and mobile devices, but it could also be for printing or for reproduction in a magazine. Whatever it is that you want to start with the highest bit depth, the widest color gamut, and the highest resolution. For that, you want to set the image sizing to off, and I'll show you this in Adobe Camera Raw. So in Adobe Camera Raw, if you click again on this workflow options, it brings up this workflow dialog box. And you can build as many presets as you want. Basically, what you want to do is configure, for example, your color space to ProPhoto RGB. And whenever you use ProPhoto RGB, if you have the option, you always want to select 16 bits per channel. You don't ever want to select 8 bits per color channel. Now, as I said, your camera may not actually be capturing 16 bits per channel. I prefer to call this high bit color. It's more than 8 bits per channel. Your camera might produce 10 bits per color, or 12 bits, or 14 bits per color. Photoshop doesn't muck up its dialog with all these different possibilities. It just calls everything that's more than 8 bits per color channel 16 bits per channel, even though it may not be. And the idea is to have more than 8 bits per color channel. This allows you overhead for editing your images, and it's really very appropriate for wide gamut color spaces like ProPhoto RGB. In image sizing, I want to make sure that this checkbox is off. Now, this is an old 8 megapixel Rebel, but it's telling me that without image sizing on, this is going to be the highest resolution. And then what I'm going to basically do is come up here and say, New Workflow Preset, and I can give it a name. And I actually did that. I have one called ProPhoto RGB Full Res, and if I select that, it gives me ProPhoto RGB, it gives me 16 bits per color channel, and full resolution. Now, let's say I really want to just do a quick and dirty rendering from this raw and put it on a web page. So what I have here is one called sRGB. The checkbox is on, and I've set it so that the width and the height, depending on the aspect ratio, will always be at least 1,000 pixels. And I can set these different options here and simply select New Workflow Preset. So what I'm going to do is click the Sharpen checkbox because I want to have it sharpened for screen. And now what I'm going to do is, you'll notice, because I had the Sharpen checkbox set, the preset updated and said edited because it saw that something changed. And now all I'm going to do is just say New Workflow Preset and call this sRGB 1000 by 1 Sharpen for screen. Click OK. And now I have this preset, and I can toggle back and forth to any of the presets that I want. But the point is, for master images, you want to have this checkbox off. You want to have the ProPhoto RGB color space set so that you can render all of the color possible from your raw data into this color space. You want 16 bits per channel selected, and click OK. And once again, you'll notice that the clipping is gone because I'm working with a very wide gamut color space. If I say Open Image, Photoshop opens the image in ProPhoto RGB 16-bit. Let's talk a little bit about DNG Camera Profiles. When you're working with Adobe Camera Raw, there are camera profiles that are supplied by Adobe, and as we'll talk about, profiles that you can actually make for your own particular camera. And what this does is simply define how the camera is going to behave under a certain color illuminant, like daylight or tungsten or fluorescent. They're conceptually very similar to ICC camera profiles of the past, but they're used in a much earlier raw processing stage, and I think they do a much better job for a number of reasons. You don't necessarily have to work with DNG files from Adobe. You just need a DNG file to build the initial color profile. DNG is an openly documented raw file format Adobe has produced, And it's only necessary to convert a target into DNG to build these color profiles, and then from there on, you don't necessarily have to use DNG in order to work with these profiles. DNG camera profiles are only applied to the actual raw data. So if you're using Adobe Camera Raw and you've opened up a non-raw file, you will not see these camera profiles. The camera profiles are based on the actual camera itself. So you'll see in this particular dropdown, instead of working with a Rebel, I'm working with a Canon 5D Mark II. And you'll see at the bottom are a number of profiles that are provided by Adobe, such as Adobe Standard, Camera Faithful, Camera Landscape. These are DNG profiles that Adobe installs for you. And the idea is that they attempt to mimic the color rendering of the in-camera JPEG with the same setting. So for example, if you were working with a 5D Mark II and you set your camera to capture a JPEG using neutral or portrait, these profiles are supposed to better mimic what you're going to get using a raw workflow instead of JPEG. But at the top, you'll see a number of DNG camera profiles that I've built, and some of them are just test profiles. You don't necessarily need a whole lot of DNG camera profiles. But the point is that when you open up Camera Raw, you're going to see the DNG camera profiles for your specific camera. And if you build a DNG profile for your camera, they will show up in this list as well. So for example, I open Camera Raw again, and I go to the camera calibration settings. You'll notice that here are a number of DNG camera profiles that were provided for this camera by Adobe. Now, this particular image was shot on the 5D Mark II. And now you'll notice that the DNG camera profiles specifically for this camera model show up in this list, which is different from the camera we saw previously. As I toggle between them, you can see that the color changes. Here's Adobe Standard, which is their preset, and here's a custom profile. And you can see that the color of the red in the background is greatly improved. As I said, the specific camera profiles are filtered by the camera model. So, what do you need to build a DNG camera profile? You simply need a Macbeth color checker, a 24 patch target, or one of the newer X-Rite Passport targets, which is very similar. If you own one of these particular targets, the software used to build these DNG camera profiles is absolutely free. You can download a copy from X-Rite on their website, or you can get the DNG Camera Profile Editor from Adobe, which builds these profiles as well as edit them. This is also free. So in order to build your own profiles, all you need is a Macbeth color checker and some free software. As I mentioned, Adobe's free software also has an editor that allows you to tweak or edit these profiles for special effects or for your own particular preferences in rendering. It's a bit geeky. We don't have time to go into it, but it's something that you may be interested in looking at. How many of these profiles do you really need? Well, surprisingly, not too many. What you're doing is you're profiling your specific sensor to how it behaves under an illuminant, like daylight or tungsten. And while Adobe did this for you, everybody's sensor is slightly different. So when you build a DNG camera profile, you're simply targeting a profile under a particular illuminant for your specific sensor. So for example, if you build a DNG camera profile in daylight, it doesn't matter what time of day you shoot the target and when you use that actual profile. That's because white balancing takes place later in the processing in Adobe Camera Raw. So think of these DNG camera profiles as being white balance agnostic. So you need one for daylight. You probably need one for tungsten. That's a completely different color illuminant. And then you have the option of building what's called a dual illuminant profile. You can shoot the target in both daylight and then tungsten and build one profile. This dual illuminant profile, I can use it under both daylight and tungsten. Let me give you an example. Here's a dual illuminant DNG camera profile that I built. Notice what happens when I toggle between daylight, which this image was shot under, which is the dual illuminant DNG profile, and a standard daylight DNG profile. There's very, very little difference. However, if I build a dual illuminant DNG camera profile and then go back into my white balance control, I have a little bit more control over how I correct this particular image by moving the tint and temp sliders. And this should be something that you do based on how the image on screen appears to you. Lastly, you'll probably want to build a DNG camera profile for some odd illuminant that you may be shooting under. For example, fluorescent lights or metal halide. If you were to go into a sports stadium and take a lot of pictures, it would probably be a good idea to capture a Macbeth color checker under the same illuminant, go back, build a DNG camera profile for that illuminant, and use it for those particular images. But by and large, you only need a few DNG camera profiles. You don't need to build one for every shot that you take, because all we're doing is profiling the basic illuminant to the camera sensor.